Did you know that one of the greatest prophetic mysteries in history is happening before our eyes? The return of the Ethiopian Jews, known as Beta Israel, is not just a historical event, but the fulfillment of ancient biblical prophecies. Many believe that this prophetic resurgence is part of a divine plan, where the promises made to Israel millennia ago are now being fulfilled before our eyes. What does this mean for the future of us all? Come and discover the fascinating journey of Beta Israel and how the history of a forgotten people resurfaces, connecting past and future. The prophetic resurgence of Beta Israel. The return of the Beta Israel to the land of Israel is not just seen as a common migration or a political phenomenon, but as the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy dating back to the Old Testament prophets. In Zephaniah 3:10, the Bible tells us about the gathering of the exiles of Israel from the islands of the sea, which many interpret as a direct reference to the return of the Ethiopian Jews to the Promised Land. For the Beta Israel, who have lived for centuries isolated in the mountains of Ethiopia, maintaining the Jewish faith in its purest forms, this return is not just a physical journey, but a deeply spiritual event. The fulfillment of this prophecy was seen on a large scale during the rescue operations in the 1980s and 1990s, when thousands of Ethiopian Jews were brought to Israel through operations such as Operation Moses, 1984, and Operation Solomon, 1991. These events were not just immigration movements, but were interpreted by many as the fulfillment of divine promises dating back millennia. The term prophetic resurgence is essential to understanding the spiritual nature of what happened with the return of the Beta Israel. For many scholars, the fact that these Jews preserved Jewish practices such as hair-cutting purity laws, religious festivals, and daily prayers, while being physically distant from the center of Judaism for so many centuries, is seen as a divine act of preservation. The prophecies about the reunion of the scattered tribes of Israel, as described in Isaiah 11:11, indicate that the return of the Beta Israel marks one of God's many redemptive acts in the end times, when he will gather the exiles from all parts of the world. Furthermore, the return of the Beta Israel to the land of Israel was not just a matter of physical immigration, but a movement that also meant the restoration of a spiritual identity. According to the scriptures, the reunion of the children of Israel is part of the divine plan for the restoration of their identity as a nation, a prophetic event that has profound implications for the future of Israel and the world. This phenomenon is considered by many to be part of Jewish eschatology, the doctrine of the last days. The return of the Beta Israel symbolizes a new phase in the process of Israel's redemption, preparing the way for the fulfillment of other messianic prophecies, which will culminate in the reign of the Messiah and the universal peace that is promised to the nations. Thus, the return of the Beta Israel is not just a historical event or a migration. It is seen as the fulfillment of a biblical promise made by God, a manifestation of divine faithfulness, and a sign that, in future times, all the prophecies of reconciliation and restoration of Israel will be fulfilled in their entirety. A people forgotten, but never lost. Amidst the dusty pages of history, there are chapters that were almost lost, voices that were almost silenced, but never in God's eyes. This is the case of the Beta Israel people. For centuries, they were relegated to the periphery of institutional Judaism, ignored by empires and academies, and silenced in official narratives. But high in the mountains of Ethiopia, far from the centers of power and influence, a people resisted, not with weapons, but with faith. They treasured the Sabbath. They fasted on the holy days. They celebrated Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot with deep reverence. They practiced circumcision on the 8th day, And they did all this without the support of a recognized rabbinate, without contact with Jerusalem, without access to the Talmud or the schools of the diaspora. Their only basis was the Torah. To the world, they were invisible, but for the God of Israel, they were exactly where they had always been, at the center of the promise. This faithfulness in the midst of oblivion is a silent miracle. How could they survive as Jews without a rabbinical structure, organized synagogues, Torah scrolls from Jerusalem, or printed liturgical books? The answer is simple and powerful. They were sustained by a living covenant, even when the world had cast them aside. So to say that Beta Israel is a forgotten people is only half the truth. Forgotten by men, perhaps, but never lost before God. As the psalmist says, "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." Psalm 27:10. This is the story of Beta Israel, a people who were faithful in anonymity, devout in invisibility, and who are now beginning to emerge as a sign of divine faithfulness. The modern awakening to the existence of Beta Israel is not just a cultural rediscovery. It is a testimony to the God who never abandons his covenants, who remembers those who call on him in spirit and in truth, even if they are hidden in the most remote folds of geography and history. And that is why, today, the world turns its eyes to this people with reverence, surprise, and, for those with spiritual discernment, prophetic awe. The archaic purity of Ethiopian Jewish faith, while world Judaism evolved over the centuries, enriched by rabbinic debates, Talmudic interpretations, and halakhic rulings, in the mountains of Ethiopia flourished a faith that seemed frozen in time, the Judaism of Beta Israel. Not a folkloric or fragmented version, but a pure, direct, and almost intact expression of the Mosaic faith, as described in the days of Moses, David, and Elijah. These people lived according to the written Torah, without the oral tradition of the Talmud. They had no Mishnah, Gemara, Midrash, or Shulchan Aruch, or all they had was the law, bare, clear, demanding, and the deep desire to fulfill it with reverence. They celebrated the feasts according to Leviticus 23. They practiced the laws of ritual purity with precision and fear. The Kohanim, priests, still operated with authority, carrying out functions that, for most Jews, had been terminated with the destruction of the temple. They were guided by elders, Kasim, who were more like the priests of old than the rabbis of the post-exile world. Their teachings did not come from philosophical treatises, but from the local oral tradition based directly on scripture. Their worship was simple, reverent, sacrificial in spirit, and often marked by intense fasting and purification. All this reveals a surprising detail. The Judaism practiced by the Beta Israelites was not a copy of medieval rabbinic Judaism. It was, in fact, a living relic of an earlier time. An open window to the period of biblical Judaism, the same one that the patriarchs lived, that the kings of Israel respected, and that the prophets called back to faithfulness. And this makes them not just a historical curiosity, but a living testimony to what Judaism might have been like before the Hellenistic, Babylonian, and Roman influences. Their practice functions almost like a spiritual fossil, not dead, but miraculously preserved. And there is something powerful in this. While the modern world rushes towards innovation and theological debates, Beta Israel points to a radical return to the root, to the simplicity of the covenant, to the purity of the original call. If the prophets cried out, "Return to the Lord, obey the Torah, keep his commandments," Beta Israel, without even hearing these words in recent centuries, was already experiencing this return. They didn't just keep the faith alive, they kept it ancient, whole, and deeply biblical. In times of syncretism and cultural accommodation, this kind of fidelity shines like gold in the desert. God's promise and spiritual identity. Beta Israel never considered themselves a converted community, but rather the legitimate heirs of the promises made to Israel. For them, Judaism was not a late adoption of a foreign religion, but the fulfillment of an ancestral lineage, deeply intertwined with Israel's history and God's covenant with the patriarchs. From the beginning, this identity was preserved amid the difficulties the community faced in Ethiopia, even in a hostile environment where they were often forced to live on the margins of society. The Beta Israel firmly held on to the conviction that they were a chosen people, guardians of the truth revealed by God to the children of Israel. Their faith was not a mere religious practice, but a spiritual and historical mission. However, this identity was not limited to compliance with religious rules. For Beta Israel, there was a deep sense of direct connection with God's promises, as they were made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They believed that the return to Israel, an event that was unfolding as they approached modern times, was not just a geographical migration, but a manifestation of the divine plan to restore the people of Israel. The scriptures that spoke of a return of the exiles, such as the prophecies of Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Zephaniah, were lived out in an intense and real way for them. Beta Israel didn't just see themselves as an isolated group, but as part of a larger, redemptive story, marked by eternal covenants and promises of restoration. The return to the land of their ancestors was not simply a political or social issue, but a deeply spiritual and prophetic action. If the people of Israel had been dispersed, Beta Israel believed that their role was linked to the fulfillment of the prophetic destiny of all Israelites. They were like the last flame of the house of Israel, preserving the light of the covenant in exile, waiting for the moment when all the tribes would be reunited again. The return to Israel, therefore, was more than an act of reconciliation with the promised land, but a manifestation of the fulfillment of a divine promise that spanned generations. The spirituality of Beta Israel was deeply rooted in this vision of cosmic and historical redemption, where God's promise would not only be fulfilled in its entirety in the return to Israel, but also in the role that this people would play in later generations as a sign and witness of God's faithfulness to his promises. The Solomonic theory and the Nagast, breaking the connection between Beta Israel and the dynasty of Solomon, is central to its historical and spiritual identity. The narrative that the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon had a son, Menelik I, and that he became the first emperor of Ethiopia, is one of the cornerstones of Ethiopian and Jewish tradition. This story, transmitted through the Kebra Nagast, an ancient Ethiopian text that recounts the rise of the Solomonic dynasty, provides a point of connection between Beta Israel and the central figures of the Hebrew Bible. The Kebra Nagast, which means the glory of kings, is an epic text that combines myth, history, and theology, and is fundamental to understanding the historical relationship between Ethiopia and Judaism. According to this tradition, after the birth of Menelik I, he was sent back to Ethiopia, where he founded the royal dynasty that would rule the country for centuries. This narrative positions Beta Israel as direct descendants of Solomon, which gives them a noble and divine identity. Although modern historiography and archaeology have not been able to confirm the historical veracity of this tradition, it remains a vital part of the Ethiopian people's self-image. The figure of Menelik I as the leader and founder of the Solomonic royal lineage, which still persists in Ethiopian tradition, is central to understanding the spiritual and historical pride of Beta Israel. This not only links them to the wisest monarch in the Bible, but also places them as part of a divinely chosen lineage that goes back to the patriarchs of Israel themselves. The Kebra Nagast also has important implications for Ethiopian Judaism, as it links Beta Israel to the Kingdom of Israel, creating an indissoluble bond with David's royal descendants. The Solomonic tradition proposes that the Ethiopians are the legitimate heirs of the Messianic promise, and that, at some point in the future, a descendant of Menelik I will be the leader, who will bring about the final restoration for the people of Israel. This idea of a messianic return also connects Beta Israel's faith with the biblical prophecies that speak of a redemptive future for the children of Israel. The figure of the Nagast breaker, which refers to the legend of the Ark of the Covenant being taken to Ethiopia, is also an expression of reverence and spiritual legitimacy. The belief that the Ark was kept secret in the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum is a key point of identity for the Ethiopian people and consequently for Beta Israel. For them, possessing the Ark of the Covenant represents the direct continuity of God's covenant with Israel, a direct link with the covenant made at Sinai. Thus, the Solomonic theory and the stories of the Kebra Nagast provide Beta Israel with an identity that transcends time, uniting them not only to the history of Israel, but also to a spiritual and historical mission. They see themselves not only as Ethiopian Jews, but as part of an eternal legacy, with a redemptive and messianic destiny that connects to the restoration of Israel and the realization of God's promises. The lost tribes and the migration of the tribe of Dan. The history of Beta Israel is also intertwined with the ancient narratives about the lost tribes of Israel, a topic that has fascinated scholars, theologians, and historians for centuries. According to one of the most debated hypotheses, Beta Israel could be one of the missing tribes that were dispersed after the conquest of the Kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Among these tribes, one of the most cited is the tribe of Dan, which, according to biblical traditions, would have been one of the 10 northern tribes of Israel that disappeared after the Assyrian exile. The theory that Beta Israel could have descended directly from the tribe of Dan suggests that these Ethiopian Jews are in fact descendants of the northern tribes of Israel, which were dispersed around the 8th century BC. The tribe of Dan is credited with a history marked by migrations and dispersions over time, especially after the Assyrian exile, when many of its members were taken to various regions of the Middle East, including North Africa. The connection with the tribe of Dan gains strength due to various traditions that exist within Ethiopian culture itself, which mention that the first Ethiopian Jews may have been descendants of the dispersed Israelites. This theory is supported by some historical and religious sources, in addition to the cultural similarities and early Jewish practices observed in Beta Israel. The practice of a pure Jewish faith without later rabbinic influences and the festivities based directly on the Torah reinforce this hypothesis, as these practices are more in line with ancient pre-exilic Judaism than with the Judaism developed after the exile. The idea that the tribes of Israel, such as Dan, could have migrated south over centuries, eventually settling in Ethiopia, is also supported by oral accounts passed down among Ethiopian communities. The presence of isolated and remote Jewish community structures in the interior of Ethiopia, such as the Lasta Mountains, can also be seen as an echo of these ancient migrations. In addition, the language and religious rituals of Beta Israel have similarities with the ancient customs of Judaism, particularly those of some tribes in northern Israel, which strengthens the idea of an ancestral connection. The relationship between Beta Israel and the lost tribes of Israel has also been explored by various scholars over the years. Some theorists suggest that Beta Israel in particular could have preserved a pure tradition of Judaism due to this geographical and cultural isolation over the centuries. These Ethiopian Jews lived in remote areas, far removed from the influences of the rabbinic traditions that dominated Judaism after the Babylonian exile. Although the direct link with the tribe of Dan has not been confirmed by definitive historical sources, Beta Israel continues to be seen as a fundamental part of the narrative of the lost tribes of Israel, with its history of preserving the Jewish faith and identity being a living witness to the Israelite dispersion. The concept of the lost tribes is emblematic for Beta Israel because, throughout their history, they have seen themselves as those who have kept the flame of Jewish tradition burning even far from the spiritual center of Judaism. This role as guardians of an ancient form of Judaism makes their journey all the more significant, with spiritual implications that intertwine with the messianic prophecies about Israel's return. Pre-rabbinic Judaism, a window on the past. Beta Israel preserves in a unique way many religious practices that date back to pre-rabbinic Judaism, that is, to a period of Jewish history prior to the writing of the Talmud and the development of the rabbinic traditions that would dominate Judaism from the 4th century CE. This places them in a unique position, not only within the history of Israel, but also in the study of Judaism as a whole. The Judaism practiced by Beta Israel is characterized by religious practices that resonate with what is known about the Judaism of biblical times, that is, Judaism before the Babylonian exile, when rabbinic norms had not yet been established. This ancient Judaism differs from many practices adopted by Jewish communities around the world after the development of the Talmud, which, among other things, established an oral rabbinic interpretation of the Torah that came to be widely followed. Among the most notable aspects of pre-rabbinic Judaism that Beta Israel preserved are the festivities, ritualistics, and the Levitical priesthood system itself. For example, Beta Israel practiced a strict observance of the purity laws, often associated with the times of the Jerusalem temple, and celebrated festivals such as Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and Pesach, Passover, in a manner similar to the biblical descriptions, without the later modifications seen in Rabbinic Judaism. The celebration of Shabbat, which occupies a central place in the life of Beta Israel, also follows an older interpretation, without the innovations that would develop over time in Rabbinic Judaism. Another aspect that places them in a distinct category is their emphasis on temple worship. Although the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the 1st century CE and Judaism adapted to its absence, Beta Israel continued to have a strong connection with the idea of the temple, maintaining a reverence for the practices that were associated with temple service. They possessed the Sefer Torah and celebrated the festivals as described in the Bible without resorting to the more complex and codified rabbinic interpretations that would emerge later. This aspect of their religious practice is also crucial to understanding how Beta Israel saw itself over the centuries. They saw themselves as custodians of the original Jewish faith, with a direct link to the biblical tradition. This also includes their liturgical language and prayer practices, which preserve primitive elements of Jewish prayer, different from the rabbinic literature that would dominate later. In addition, Beta Israel maintains cultural and spiritual traditions that are a direct reflection of how Judaism was practiced before the Babylonian exile. The very Levitical priesthood that existed among them was seen as a direct link to biblical times, with a constant concern to preserve the purity of priestly lineages. This preservation of ancient practices and laws makes Beta Israel a living window into ancient Judaism, a historical testimony of how the faith was practiced long before the formation of the rabbinic traditions we know today. Ultimately, Beta Israel offers scholars and the Jewish world a unique opportunity to observe early Judaism in action, as opposed to Rabbinic Judaism, which came to predominate after the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem and the dispersion of the Jewish people. By studying the tradition of Beta Israel, it is possible to get a glimpse of Judaism as it was practiced in ancient times, before it became post-Babylonian Judaism, dominated by oral and rabbinic traditions. The local conversion hypothesis and academic debates over the decades, various theories have emerged to try to explain the origins of Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish people. One of the most discussed hypotheses, particularly among academics and scholars, is that of local conversion, which suggests that Beta Israel arose not from a direct lineage of Israelite tribes, but from a conversion of local populations in Ethiopia to Judaism. This theory proposes that, over centuries, populations in the Ethiopian region may have converted to Judaism through contacts with Jews from northern Israel or Egypt. These contacts would have been established since ancient times and intensified throughout history, especially at times when trade and cultural interactions between the ancient world were more dynamic. The Jewish tradition was already known in some regions of East Africa, and the Ethiopian kings were at some point exposed to Judaism or even influenced by it. According to this theory, the Beta Israel were not direct descendants of Israelite tribes, but rather a community of Ethiopians who over generations adopted Jewish religious practices, either through the influence of Hellenistic Judaism or through other Jewish groups from the diaspora who arrived in Ethiopia. This local conversion would have taken place gradually, perhaps over centuries, until Jewish traditions and rituals were consolidated as part of the religious heritage of those Ethiopian communities. However, proponents of the local conversion hypothesis face challenges, as many members of the Beta Israel community claim to have direct ancestral origins in ancient Israel, citing oral traditions and sacred texts that go back to biblical stories, such as the visit of the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon and the descent of King Menelik I. The legend that the Queen of Sheba had a son with King Solomon and that Menelik I founded an Ethiopian royal dynasty is also one of the pillars of this historical narrative that connects Beta Israel to biblical Israel, and not to a simple conversion. On the other hand, there are scientific arguments that point to the viability of a local conversion as a plausible explanation. Genetic research carried out on the DNA of Jewish groups around the world has shown that the Beta Israel population shares some common genetic characteristics with other Jewish groups, but also presents a significant number of genetic differentiations that suggest a possible mixture with the local Ethiopian population, which could be a reflection of a conversion over generations, with cultural and genetic influences specific to the region. Furthermore, the practice of Judaism in Beta Israel is unique in many ways. Festivities such as Yom Kippur and Sukkot are carried out with rituals that do not exactly coincide with those practiced by Jews in other parts of the world, especially with regard to the calendar and forms of worship. In addition, the Levitical priestly system of Beta Israel was maintained without the modifications of Rabbinic Judaism, which also gives rise to questions about whether these traditions are the fruit of a real connection with the Israelite tribes, or whether they originated from a local population's own interpretation of Judaism. Even so, the academic debate on the origins of Beta Israel remains open. Archaeological, anthropological, and genetic research is underway to try to clarify the origins of this people, but to this day, there is no consensus on which of the theories is the most plausible. In the meantime, Beta Israel remains one of the most enigmatic communities within the Jewish universe, with a history of faith, resistance, and preservation of traditions that defy easy explanations, whether through local conversion or a direct ancestral lineage. In short, the distinction between Rabbinic Judaism and the faith of Beta Israel is grounded in historical roots, liturgical practices, and interpretations of divine laws. Although the two traditions share a common origin and identity, their differences reflect how each has evolved over the centuries and how, despite their differences, Beta Israel remains an undeniable part of the people of Israel. These distinctions enrich the tapestry of Jewish identity, reminding us of the diversity and depth of faith and tradition that the people of Israel have preserved throughout the ages.